All right, welcome everyone. I'm excited that you're here. My name again is Kerry Wixted. I'm a local naturalist here in Maryland, and I'm coming to you from my former position as the state agency's coordinator for the Partners of Amphibian and Reptile Conservation. And in that role, I helped work with different state agencies, the state herpetologists across the United States and in places like Canada to work on national and international reptile and amphibian issues. But I will put the qualifier in that I am not a herpetologist myself. I just got to work with some really amazing herpetologists and learn from them. And I'm going to talk to you tonight about some of the amazing world of amphibian communication, not just sound communication that we think about, but also things like color communication and chemical communication and other methods. And we'll talk about species from around the world and some of the things that they do, as well as species that we have locally here in Maryland. And feel free to drop your questions in the chat. I will try my best to answer them as I go along. I'm going to drop a link as well. It's to a resource called a Wakelet. And that resource basically has a lot of the different research papers that I'll talk about. So if you want to learn more information, then you can go to that Wakelet and see that information there. So again, I'm coming to you from my former role with Partners Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, but I love them so much that I still am volunteering to kind of spread the word about this organization. For those of you who are not familiar with PARC, they are all about forging proactive partnerships to conserve amphibians, reptiles, and the places that they live. And PARC actually is not an official organization or 501c3 or anything like that. It literally is a partnership of people coming together to support reptile and amphibian conservation. And so there's a state coordinator, which was the role that I served in, and a federal coordinator through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who is Michelle Chrisman. And then a PARC functions because of ARC, the Amphibian and Reptile Conservancy, which provides a small financial stipend to kind of keep the lights on and things running. But if you're not familiar with PARC, it's a great organization and lots of different resources come out of PARC. And it's a great way for people to come together. And there are regional parks as well. So here in Maryland, we're kind of between Northeast Park and Southeast Park. But it's a great way to get involved if you want to learn more about reptile and amphibian conservation. So tonight we're going to talk about amphibians, and I always got a preface of like why these different groups are so cool. And amphibians serve in a lot of different roles. We often think of amphibians as important predators in our ecosystems. They're eating a lot of invertebrates, especially things like mosquito larvae and midges and worms and other types of things. So those are important roles that they play, but not only are they important predators, but they are also important prey species as well. And if you think about this time of year, in particular, where amphibians are all out breeding and everything, they're having these explosive breeding events where they're literally laying like hundreds and thousands of eggs. Those are going to hatch into larvae, and most of them don't make it. And because most of them don't, or a lot of them are not making it because other things are eating them. And so they're functioning in that really important prey role in addition to that predator role. Amphibians, particularly ones that kind of burrow down into the grounds and spend a lot of time down in the leaf litter, are also important for nutrient cycling. Some of our amphibian species are really sensitive to changes in, oops, sorry, did my screen change? Sorry. So some of our amphibians are very sensitive to changes in their environment, and so we consider them to be ecosystem indicators. Not all amphibians, I'll put that qualifier out there because there are some species like bullfrogs in particular that are very, plastic with where they can live. They can live in just about anywhere, but there are other amphibians that are really, really sensitive to changes in the environment. For example, species like our hellbender salamanders, which really are indicators of clean water in some of those mountain systems that they're found in. We're also learning a lot from amphibians and how they survive and live. And just like other taxa groups, we've had several medical advances and are looking to amphibians for biotechnology. I have our friend the wood frog here on the screen. This is one of our early amphibians that comes out of its hibernate or brumation rather early. And that's because it has a high glucose concentration in its blood that essentially acts like an antifreeze. And it allows them to essentially slowly freeze without any problems to their organs or dying or anything like that. And this allows our wood frogs to be some of the widest ranging frog species in North America into these northern climates, even all the way up to Alaska. And so researchers are looking at how wood frogs can survive this freezing and try to apply that wood frog adaptation to medical technology for organ transplants to help keep organs essentially preserved longer, so we have a longer time between the donor and the recipient for transplant surgery. So just one of the many examples of ways that we're looking at what amphibians do naturally and trying to apply it to our lives. And there are other examples with some of the toxins that animals have. They're being used for cancer drugs and stroke drugs and all sorts of different things. So moving along to amphibian communication, there are many different ways that amphibians communicate. So, and this isn't just for amphibians, other organisms communicate with different methods as well. Typically, when we think of amphibian communication, we're thinking about sound, but amphibians can also communicate with color, with different movement patterns. Some of them sing and dance, and some of them also have that physical touch communication as well. And then we have amphibians that are also using chemical communications to communicate with themselves or with each other and with other organisms. When we think about kind of that color communication that kind of goes along with those chemical communications, poison dart frogs are usually that classic example, particularly of warning coloration. So Mullerian mimicry is when an unpalatable or a distasteful or untasty species looks like another species. And so this phenomena is evident in things like viceroys and monarchs. They both look alike and they're both toxic to predators like blue jays and other birds. So these Ramitomaya poison dart frogs in the Peruvian Amazon are a rare example of Mullerian mimics in vertebrates. And so they have the different color morphs that represent some of these mimic patterns that essentially mimic some of the poison dart frogs species that live in those same areas. So all
Well,
four
yeah,
frogs,
that would have to because it's
sorry, all four frogs in the center of the photo are the same species, but they live in different areas. And they actually mimic those other frog species that you can see on the outer edges that are actually the poison ones. So the researchers Stuckert et al. Found that these color patterns are likely to be affected by a combination of developmental patterns of gene expression and also color morph specific gene variants, but it's something that you can see in things like these frogs, and you can see it in other organisms like different taxa groups as well. Another form of color communication, one that we're just starting to learn about, is biofluorescence. So biofluorescence is the ability to absorb visible and ultraviolet light and remit it at a lower energy level. So for example, blue light is being re-emitted as green light, as you can see here on the screen. These photos are from a research project by a park member, Dr. Jennifer Lamb, and her colleagues. And essentially, they found that these different salamanders have these unique biofluorescence patterns. And so this was found only just recently in 2020. So we're still trying to figure out this biofluorescence. And to qualify, this biofluorescence, humans can't see the biofluorescence because we can't see an ultraviolet color wavelengths, but other organisms that do see in that UV spectrum, this is what the salamanders look like at night. You imagine these little glowing things walking around on the forest floor. So a few years after Dr. Lamb and her colleagues published this paper, Dr. Jonathan Cox and Benjamin Fitzpatrick recently found that the biofluorescence patterns of southern gray cheek salamanders were different for the males versus the females. So that might be one of the ways that they're communicating the sex to other organisms at night by these different fluorescence patterns. And we also know that some of these species, like the spotted salamanders, you can actually identify individuals by the spot patterns. So this might even be a way that individuals are identifying and communicating with one another with these fluorescence patterns, but something we're still learning about. So another way that amphibians communicate with one another and other organisms, we have this thing called the Unken reflex, which is this defensive posture. And it's employed by a lot of like salamanders and newts, but we do see some frogs like the ones on the screen showing this Unken reflex. And essentially, it's a way to warn potential predators before an attack that I don't taste good or I'm poisonous and you just don't want to touch me. So the individual will essentially arch their bodies and show off these colorful patterns on the underside of the animals that have these warning colorations, bright yellows and oranges and sometimes reds. And during these behaviors, they usually close their eyes and or cover them and essentially, to protect their eyes and all of that during this Unken reflex. So for some individuals that have toxins, they might also release a substance in an effort to repel the offending predator. And some of them are really, really extreme. So this is an example of a newt showing you the Unken reflex and kind of showing off that bright coloration pattern on the underside. And most newt species have tetrodotoxins, I believe, and that's one of the neurotoxins that are found on newt skins. And so that's why this one is kind of showing off that the coloration that you don't want to mess with me. Another really cool, brightly colored organism is the Panamanian golden frog. And the Panamanians look to the golden frog as a symbol of good luck because, as legend has it, the frogs turn into gold after they die. Can't verify that or not, but they are a beautiful golden color while they are alive. And essentially, these critically endangered frogs are actually highly toxic, but very social. And so what they do is they call to other golden frogs and other species. And so they use these special hand signals where they do these little waves to get the attention of other organisms or sometimes each other while they're out in Central and South America. So they some of these movements can be friendly or aggressive warnings. So for example, sometimes they'll wave and they'll lift up their feet to potential predators to let them know that they're not only gorgeous, but they're also toxic. And sometimes the waving patterns can be indicative of whether they're annoyed about something or trying to get the attention of potentially a lovely lady. So while vocalizations are uncommon with salamander species, there are a few that actually can make noises. And notably, all the way up in the Pacific Northwest, there's the Pacific giant salamander. And over here in the east, we have the mud puppy, which is essentially extirpated from Maryland. This is a species that is no longer here in Maryland. But it has been, found in other areas. In a lot of areas, the mud puppy is not doing so hot as an aquatic salamander species. But the Pacific giant salamander pictured on the left actually makes some growling noises when it feels threatened or upset. And the mud puppy gets its common name because it makes squeaky noises when it's distressed. So mud puppies are large salamanders with these kind of like red feathery gills that you can see, and those gills persist even as adults. So they keep their gills throughout their lives and never leave the water. And so mud puppies actually are more found in central North America than in the fringes. I think Maryland, we might be kind of at the edges of their range. So I am going to show you um, the And I'm sorry, I have to stop sharing because I forgot to share my sound. But I am going to show you a quick video of that Pacific giant salamander so you can kind of hear that growling noise that they make. All right. So that is one upset Pacific giant salamander. And that's by Mike Westfall. I believe he's a USGS researcher out in the Pacific Northwest. So I was asking in the chat before we all got started to find out if anybody was hearing anybody calling tonight, because this week, or actually last week, the wood frogs started calling in parts of Maryland, and I expect that there might be a chorus out tonight with the rain that we got earlier today and this warm spell that just kind of came through. So tonight might be a really, really good night for our local amphibians. So just like us, frogs produce sound by essentially passing that exhaled air over their vocal cords while coordinating with their lungs, essentially. But they breathe a little differently than humans. So they bring in air through their nose and they take a nice deep breath and they expand the floor of their mouth. And then they kind of close off their nostrils and force that air into their lungs to create kind of a vibration when it's exhaled. And so that vibrates over those vocal cords and that helps produce the sounds that we hear. The sounds are then amplified by passing the air into the frog's vocal sacs, which expand, as you can see on these pictures of our spring peepers. And their mouths essentially act like little resonation chambers. So some of them have those pouches that inflate underneath their mouths, and then some of them also have kind of pouches that inflate on the sides of their mouth. And so frog calls, unlike bird calls, can really vary due to temperatures. And this is one of the reasons why it's difficult to get some of with all the use of the auto ID song callers that are being used for birds and bats, the variation that we see in frog and toad calls based on temperature and time of year, and sometimes even things like humidity, really makes it difficult to have some of those auto IDers. But there are these frog loggers that will record the calls, and then you can take those recordings back into the lab and identify the species. Okay. And my screen's frozen. So I'm going to give my screen a second. It's freezing at the moment. But I see a question in the chat. When are we likely to hear spring peepers in Baltimore? And now should be a good time to start hearing spring peepers. Spring peepers are one of these species that will actually call throughout the year. So they will call, I heard them calling in November and December. If you get a warm enough time, then you will get those animals calling. I apologize. I'm going to stop sharing because it looks like my screen has frozen up. Having all sorts of technical difficulties tonight. One thing about spring peepers is that they can make different calls as well. They make the peep noise, but they can also make some of these creak type noises. And so that gets people confused with our local chorus frogs that kind of sound like somebody's running their finger over a comb edge. And then the peepers, when it is that time of year, this time of year for breeding and everything, they're going they can like call something crazy like, I don't know, I want to say like 200 times a minute or something wild. There's some like really cool statistics about how much they can call. Okay. So I apologize about that technical difficulty, but hopefully you can see my screen with these frog species. The earliest calling breeding frogs that we have here in Maryland are the wood frogs. And so I was getting reports last week when we had a little bit of that warm spell before the temperatures just took that nosedive that some of the wood frogs were coming out. And as I said earlier, they have these widespread ranges all the way, down to the southeastern United States and up to Canada. They're the only frog that can be found in Alaska as well. Excuse me. And so they can come out really early because of that cryoprotectant or that extra sugar in their blood. So their calling is tied to ambient temperatures, and researchers in Alaska have found that their breeding events are starting to shift in the face of climate change. They're starting to shift earlier and earlier based on those temperature shifts and all of that. And they kind of sound like a bunch of clucking chickens or ducks. So this is a real ephemeral noise that we have here in the springtime. And I'm going to play this for you really quick. So that's that kind of clucking noise and all of and you'll hear like hundreds of them all at once. So they're our earliest species that you're going to hear. And then the next breeders that typically come out are our spring peepers. And a little bit later on down in the spring, so later in the spring, we will hear our American toads and our Fowler's toads, both of which we have in southern Maryland. And the toads have this kind of whistling trill noise to them. So pictured here on the screen are some American toads. This is a larger female here with two males that are competing for her. You can see. My friends hit. Oh. Can you hear me all right? I'm seeing that I'm muted.
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So that one's the male. He's making that characteristic trill. And you'll hear like the little chuckles in the background. The burp, burp, burp. And that's essentially one of the competing males telling the offending male that you need to leave me alone. This is my lady. And sometimes they'll do that because sometimes you'll see these like giant mating balls as well, where there's so many males that will just start jumping on top of each other. And so they sometimes even start grabbing each other, and they have like a special call that they make that says, hey, I'm not a female, you need to let go of me. And I'll play it again. You'll just hear that noise, that extra noise right in the beginning. That one. That little burp, 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 burp. That's the whining noise, essentially. Okay, moving along to another later spring species are our eastern spadefoot toads. And I totally adore spadefoots. They're probably like one of my favorite local species. And they're one of these explosive breeders, but they only come out when you get a really warm, heavy rain at night. And so eastern spadefoot toads spend the majority of their time underground. They're the only spadefoot toad species east of the Mississippi. As you go west, there are different species of spadefoots that also spend most of their time underground. And I love spadefoots because they always look really, really derpy to me. They're just really cool critters. They're not true toads. And that's because they don't have those poison parotid glands there behind the eyes. So technically, eastern spadefoot toads are frogs. And they're called spadefoots because on their hind feet, they've got this little keratinized digit back here that you can see on this picture. And that's that spade that allows them to dig really, really quickly into sandy soils where they make their homes and spend most of their lives. So they have these explosive breeding events where, like, literally all of a sudden you get a heavy rain one night and thousands of them come up to the surface. They do their breeding thing, they mate, they lay their eggs. Those eggs all hatch in like less than a week into tadpoles, and then everything else goes back underground except for those tadpoles. So it's something that's really, really easy to miss if you're not looking for it. And they also have a really wild call. And I'm just going to play this, but it's just an individual. You rarely ever hear an individual. You're going to hear lots of them, and I feel like to me it kind of sounds like a barfing barn animal, like a goat or something like that. I'm like rah. So listen to this. Rah. But imagine like hundreds or thousands of them making that noise and just calling everywhere. There was one time that I was at Quiet Waters Park in Anne Arundel County leaving after an evening teaching event, and it took me like an hour to get out of the park because there were just so many spadefoots all over the road, and I kept stopping and trying to like push them off the road. And then I was just like captivated by all the noises that they were making because it was just such a cool event. And then it just disappears. And so there's so many people don't realize that these are out there and this is happening. So we get a nice, really, really warm, like 60 something degree day where it's just pouring down rain at night. That's when those spadefoots are going to be coming out. So moving along to our other later spring callers, we have things like pickerel frogs and our leopard frogs. These can get confused with one another based on like the patterns that they have. They have kind of similar patterns to the untrained eye, but the pickerel frogs have more of these rectangular patterns on their backs. And then the leopard frogs, also the southern leopard frogs, have that white spot on their eardrum, aka the tympanum. So both of these are kind of our medium-sized frogs. The leopard frogs can have a little bit more green on their face and all of that. And then the pickerel frogs in particular have this bright yellow in between their legs. That's called flash coloration, and we see that in a couple of our frog species, like our gray tree frogs and things like that. And that's to distract predators. So when they're going to jump, the predators are supposed to see that bright yellow inner leg because it's easier for them to lose a leg and survive than to lose your head and survive. So that's why they think they have that flash coloration. So the pickerel frogs have a soft grating kind of snore noise that they make. So I'm going to play that. Hear that snore. So as you go up north, there are northern leopard frogs, which kind of have a similar snore, but it's a longer snore. So you have to like count the seconds for the snore to kind of distinguish between the two species. But we mostly have the southern leopard frogs here. And the southern leopard frogs, they also have these like prominent ridges that are running down their backs. And those are usually, light colored ridges, and they have much more rounder spots than those kind of squarish rectangular spots that you see on the pickerel frogs. And these ones have guttural croaks that are followed by like clucking noises. So they can be sometimes confused with the wood frogs, but they're going to be a little bit later in the season. And then some of their croaks actually sound like somebody rubbing balloons together. You can hear other frogs in the background, like that creak noise from I think that was one of the spring peepers making something similar to one of our chorus frogs. So the last frog calls that I'm going to go over tonight for local frogs. We've got a lot more than the species that I'm presenting, but I just wanted to go through some of our other species. The cricket frogs are going to be more something that you'll hear during the summer. You'll hear them. These are really tiny frogs. They're small, like the spring peepers. And it's hard to tell from this photo, but they have like this dark triangular patch between the eyes. And these ones make a noise kind of sounding like a clicking noise, like a big bunch of clicking noises out in the ponds. You're going to find them in ponds, lakes, and other slow moving embodiments of water. playing the carpenter frog first. There it goes. That clicking noise are our northern cricket frogs. Now, the carpenter frogs are mainly found over on the eastern shore, and they make a noise that kind of sounds more like, to me, like a ratchet, and instead of something like when I think of carpenter, I think of a hammer, but it's more of a clicky noise that they make. Lives. A little bit more of that ratchet noise. So they found that in the carpenter frogs, the intensity of the calls varies according to body size, with smaller frogs having higher pitched calls and lower intensity calls coming from larger males. So if anybody is an educator or is interested in teaching more about some of our different frog calls, one activity that we have online is this frog talk activity. It's made for kids, but I use it with adults as well. And it's kind of fun because you get a card with a type of frog on it, and then in the green it has like kind of the mnemonic for how that frog song would sound. For example, our green frogs, they look like our bullfrogs, and they sound like somebody plucking a banjo, like dunk, dunk, dunk. So you're supposed to make those noises and find other frogs that are making the same noises as you. And then it has just some little natural history facts about the different animals. And so it's a great way to teach about frog calls, learn about them, and then just be nice and silly. So I often use it as an icebreaker activity. So before I finish off with frog calls and start to get into some of the other forms of communication, I do want to share the desert rain frog, which is a unique species that's found in Africa. It's this perfectly plump little frog, and it's found in a very small range in Africa between Namibia and South Africa. And unlike other frogs, a lot of other frog species, it's one of the few species that actually have like this direct development from eggs into adults. So it kind of like bypasses that tadpole stage. And that's just because it lives in these really dry habitats, and there's no way it could really survive a tadpole stage, essentially. And so they live in these dune habitats, and they are really like fog. The dew that kind of collects from fog in those dunes is actually one of their reasons that helps them survive. And that's where they get a lot of their moisture. And then they have this formidable squeak that they emit when they're upset.
But sometimes more unexpected sounds grab our attention. Like this desert rain frog. Squeaking viral sensation. $11 million hits and counting.
It's like the cutest thing ever, and that is it trying to be angry and tell you to leave it alone. So I adore them so much. So it's important to note that calling for frogs and birds too, it takes a lot of energy, and it requires a high level of respiration. And so calling is usually done during, for at least for our frogs and toad species, they're usually expending this energy during breeding season to attract potential partners. So, and some of it is, how good you are at singing can show off your fitness and, your genetics and all of that. So one record calling frog species is the small-headed tree frog, and it can produce 100 notes per minute for several hours, requiring up to 25 times more oxygen than some of the other amphibians that you'll find around. So pretty amazing set of lungs that this thing has. Of course, there are species that will use different things like leaves and water and pipes and storm drains and trees to help amplify the noise. For a lot of you who are out there who are birders, you're probably really familiar with our local woodpeckers. They like to amplify noises when they're doing their drumming, their breeding drumming. They love to drum on metal surfaces like gutter pipes and all of that, or those decaying branches that are nice and hollow and make those noises. So I'll play this quick video here. So we see a lot of these tinier frog species that will use these things like leaves and all of that to help amplify the noises. When I was in Borneo this past summer, there's these tiny little frogs that were in the pitcher plants, and they called from the pitcher plants to amplify the noises. And the pitcher plants are those big vase-shaped carnivorous plants. So when you're little, you gotta throw your voice somehow, right? And there are even some that, in some of these areas where there are a lot of different frogs calling, if you've gone out to any of these local spring peeper ponds during peak calling season, like your ears can hurt at times. And imagine if you were in like a rainforest environment and you are competing not only with the frogs that are calling, the toads, but you've got all sorts of nighttime insects that are calling and birds that are calling. Sometimes you got to get creative to get your song out there. And so this concave-eared torrent frog lives in really noisy places along fast-moving streams in Asia. And to kind of overcome the noise of that rushing water, they actually communicate in ultrasonic frequencies. And to be able to hear that ultrasonic sound, the males and the females have these specialized eardrums, they're tympanums that allow them to hear those noises. And so something I didn't talk about earlier too is in some of our frog species in particular, you can actually tell the differences between the males and the females based on the size of the eardrum, aka the tympanums, because usually I think it's in this picture, it's the female that has the bigger tympanum, but I feel like our local frog species, it's the males that have the larger tympanums, but I might be incorrect there. And finally, the last thing you might be wondering is, do frogs have accents? And there actually were scientists who looked into this just recently, and they found that yes, frogs do have accents based on where they lived. So essentially, frogs that populations of the same species that were further away from one another had slight variations in the types of calls that they were doing. So those variations are kind of like those accents. And over time, you started to see even like that shifts in the times of calling. Some of them are a few days apart. Some of them can call a few months apart, in addition to having kind of different pitches that they might use. So that's just some of that probably evolution that's happening there. Moving along to other forms of communication, there are some species that dance to also get attention of other organisms and each other. So these Brazilian torrent frogs dance by shuffling and bobbing, and they'll also awkwardly wave. They don't get enough attention. Here's one of them calling. And then if you watch, you see it's like hind foot. It's kind of hard to see, but in his hind foot, he's going to start waving it. Very slight when they wave their foot. See little foot wave there. So this is another species that lives in one of these noisy environments. So they're adding that kind of foot waving and moving to get the attention of other frogs. You see the foot there and all of that. And so they'll awkwardly wave if they're not getting enough attention from the females. And if the female does start showing them attention, what they'll actually do is they'll come up and touch the male And then the male, by touching the male, is going to incite him to do his real fancy footwork and special dance moves as well. So this is just another example of that communication using sound and dance to communicate. There are also multiple forms of chemical communication that occur in amphibians, and as you can see from this chart by Woodley, it's really cool. You know, we see things like these are mostly different salamanders. The plethodonid salamanders are lungless salamanders, like the redback salamanders and a lot of our woodland salamanders. They have special glands. The mental glands are in their chin, and they have, you know, these glands that they use to produce some of these scents that they're laying down. The nophthalmus are the different newt species, like our eastern newts. And so, you know, they're different species, and a lot of them will have these glands in different areas. So that'll allow them to put down these chemical cues to kind of communicate with one another and sometimes with other species as well. So our eastern newts, you might be familiar with their juvenile form, the red Fs. And actually, eastern newts, I just recently learned, can live like 12 to 15 years. And so they have an aquatic larvae that they start off with, and then they go into that juvenile red F stage on land, and then this is the adult stage that is back to the water. So this is the aquatic stage. And so they both have these cloacal, which are, you know, essentially their holes in their back end. The cloaca is the common sewer where they go to the bathroom out of and mate out of and all of that. So they have cloacal glands, and they also have cheek glands or genial glands. And essentially, they apply secretions to one another. So the males will apply the secretions to the female's nose, as you can kind of see here. This that's those cheek glands on this male, and he's kind of rubbing it on the female that he's got in a little bit of a chokehold there. And so this, you know, this is a way to tell her that he's interested in her, and she can get some chemical cues a little bit about their fitness, his fitness as a male, and you know how good his genes might be. And they found that not only do males communicate with these chemical cues in these glands, but the females will also release chemicals into the water to indicate their presence and their receptivity to breeding. So if they're ready to breed and everything like that, they'll leave those chemical cues behind. They found that uh, most of the time the males are going to react to the females, but not other male chemical signatures. So they don't always react to that potential competition. And they've also found that they essentially the males prefer bigger females. So. And then one of our most common salamander species in the United States are these redback salamanders. So this is the classic redback phase. And then they have the leadback phase as well that doesn't have the pattern, but they're the same species. And fun fact, these are the newest DC amphibian that Powell Elementary students helped nominate as the amphibian for the District of Columbia, and now it's all nice and official. But these are one of the most common salamander species in the eastern United States. So they are all over. They're very wide-ranging species. And they found that like there are literally thousands of these on the forest floor. And when I was talking about being very important prey species, these are super important prey species. They're one of the woodland salamanders, the lungless plethodonid species, and all of that. And they found, researchers have found that the fecal pellets of redback salamanders is one of the ways that the males communicate to the females, because essentially the quality of his diet, he's going to have special poop that's going to say, hey, I'm good at getting food, I'm good at getting fed, smell my poop. And that is going to tell the female that he's a very fit individual and she should breed with him. essentially if she wants to have nice, strong offspring. So there are also some frog species that have been found to essentially communicate via feces. I mean, this isn't unknown. We think about a lot of our mammal species, they also communicate with feces. And so this is just an example of how our local salamanders are doing that on our forest floors. So I saw a question in the chat earlier when I was talking about the Panamanian frogs that essentially there was a fungus that has really devastated the populations and essentially they're not there in the wild anymore. And that is, yes, that is one of our chytrid funguses, which is here in North and Central America and South America. We're dealing with a number of diseases for our amphibians. As well as other factors that you can see here on the screen, like habitat loss and degradation and climate change. This time of year, roads are also a big problem for a lot of our local amphibians as they're going to breed. So globally, the numbers aren't the hottest. We're looking at 41% of our amphibian species across the world are in danger of extinction. And so it's a pretty big issue. But there are things that you can do to kind of help our local species as well. And one of those things is to teach other people about our species. And hopefully you learned a couple tidbits tonight with the different calls and communication techniques and how they use poop and other types of things to communicate. And maybe you can pass that on to your friends, your family, and other people that are willing to listen to you. And so help bring that education and awareness. So as I said, I'm not a herpetologist, but I get to hang out with a lot of herpetologists the last couple years, and I've just been picking up all these little factoids from all of them. And it's just been a really fascinating group of animals to learn about. With many of our other species, our birds and other animals, including our amphibians, the more that you can do to kind of restore habitat, even in small spaces like your backyards, the better it's going to be for these different species. And I always think about how much habitat is essentially locked up into lawns and how if we connected all of our different backyards and created these corridors, we could support so many more wildlife species. So think about that when you're doing your native plantings and think about those invertebrates. Those are just as important for our local bird species as they are for our amphibians, as well as, the pesticides that we might use on the plants and to kill some of those invertebrates. Those can also get into our amphibians and move up into the food web. So there have been studies with things like wild turkeys. They actually eat a lot of salamanders. It's like a big part of some of their diet. They're scratching around in that leaf litter and they're eating some of those salamanders, those redback salamanders there on the ground. So what's getting into those salamanders is going and moving up in the food chain. Obviously, a lot of our aquatic birds are out there munching on the frogs and the toads as well. So thinking about that magnification of those things in our food chain. This time of year, thinking about amphibians and roads, really, really important. I might actually go out tonight and just go look at some of the spots where there's some streams that kind of go under the roads because there are usually a lot of amphibians on the roads that need some help across. So on rainy nights like this in the spring, think about look for little frog-shaped objects on the road, and if it's safe enough, pull over and help them out, help them across. Just like if you were to find a turtle, you can get the shell off the road, but always make sure you're moving your turtles in the direction of travel for them, and only help these animals out, stop and all of that if it's safe to do so for you and for other people. The other things to do is just keeping our wild animals wild. There are a lot of animals that need homes and could be adopted. So they're really, really cute outside, but they belong outside. And don't release any pets or captive animals because that's how some of these diseases like chytrids and ranaviruses are getting into our local systems. The final thing is making sure you disinfect shoes and equipment, especially if you're going into these vernal pool habitats or these temporary wetlands this time of year. So I have on the link that I'll share in the chat, there's some disinfection information. It's mainly for like researchers and all of that, but we also have a video on the park page about how to do simple disinfections. And it's really, really important because we can accidentally bring some of these diseases into these wetlands, and the nursery stages or the younger stages are the ones that are the most susceptible to some of these diseases. And the other flip side of this is by cleaning off your shoes, like, using a brush, knock off all that mud and rinsing it off with a light bleach solution and rinsing it off with water. You're going to clean your shoes of any potential things like invasive plant seeds that might also get stuck into those boot treads and get transported into those areas. So it's kind of like a double duty that you're doing there. And if you're interested in the frog calls and helping out with science, I know some of you might do Christmas bird counts and some of these um, uh, bird count studies and all of that. But locally, we have Frog Watch, and actually, there's a national Frog Watch, and there are different chapters and all of that that you can get involved with. I know there's one in Montgomery County, and I think Calvert County has a Frog Watch chapter as well. And so this is the time of year you can get involved, go out, listen for these different frogs on these defined routes and submit that information. And this is really, really important because it's helping us identify where some of these species are starting to decline in different areas, this silent decline of our amphibian species. And so Frog Watch is one of the best community science platforms that's going to help provide that kind of data. We don't have all of that data like the bird groups do. So this is a helpful way. And another thing you can do is get involved with Parks Amphibian Week. So this is an international celebration of all things amphibian. It's held the first full week in May, which will be May 4th through 10th this year. We'll have some events in the DC region at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum and at the National Zoo, and then on the DC Mall and places like that. Hopefully, you'll have some events online as well, and folks around the world are starting to submit their events that they're doing. And so we have a page on the Park Place website for Amphibian Week, and you can see there's a map that's currently, as people are planning events, it's getting populated with different events. So you can check all that out. We've got social media tools. I submitted a proclamation for the state of Maryland to recognize Amphibian Week this year, so we'll see if that goes through. But there's a bunch of resources up there, and I hope you get to join in. And don't want to forget the turtles too. So even though this amphibian talk, will have Wild Turtle Week in June as well. So with that, I know there's some questions in the chat, and I am going to stop sharing my screen and start answering some questions. So thank you all. All right. And I might have missed some of these questions. So if I don't see your question or if I don't answer your question, let me know. So I see a question from Eddie, and he wanted to know, are the tympanums only used for ultra high frequencies? And that's a great question, Eddie. So no, they're not just used for ultra high frequencies. The tympanums, those eardrums, are used for different frequencies. So there's just that one species of frog that has those ultrasonic hearing, essentially. But everybody else should hear the different ranges that we hear, plus some. So good question there. And I see a question from Susanna. With chemical cues, do they use specific trees or plants to leave their scent? And that's an excellent question. And I'm not sure about, if these different amphibians are using, specific spots to leave their scents. I do know, I know a lot about mammals, and I know that mammals will pick certain areas to leave their scents, or think about like how, this log is higher up than all these other logs, and this is going to be a good spot to put my scent down. And some animals are also attracted to specific species because of like the chemical signatures in the plants. But I can't think of any specific examples where they're using certain trees or plants. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. I see a question from Francis. Is there a Merlin app for frog calls? And I wish there was. And I talked to the folks with Wildlife Acoustics who make the song meters and then the bat meters that have those collars that you can attach to your phones and actually do the auto ID. And this was a couple years ago, but the person at the show said that because frogs change their songs so much based on like temperature and humidity and sometimes time of year and all of that, that they've had a difficult time getting one of those recorders to be able like to figure out that essentially AI technology to auto identify the frog calls. So they're not there yet. People are working on it, but there's some difficulties because they're not as consistent as things like birds for calling. Um, and um, and so there are recording devices though, like there are these things like the frog loggers and stuff like that that researchers will attach to trees and record it. And then I know you can take those back to the lab and use some of the software to parse out the different species. But it's not in that easy to use app form just yet. A lot of that's just available to researchers who have the budgets. So. Okay. I see a question from Ellie. Does the move them in the direction they're going count for frogs too? That's a really good one. I usually do try to move the frogs or toads or in the direction that they're going. But salamanders, I definitely move them in the direction that they're going, especially this time of year. A lot of our salamanders are going back to wherever they were born, at least for, the ones that are migratory, like the spotted salamanders, which are probably coming out tonight. They're going to be going back to those vernal pools where they were born to be able to lay their eggs. And sometimes roads and things like that have sprung up. So if you move them to where they came from, they're still going to have that instinct to cross the road and go back to that spot. So yeah. All right. Next question from Jan. Do you have an opinion about toad abodes? I love the concept of toad abodes. They're essentially, you can put out little terracotta pots and things like that. You can get fancy ones that you can buy online. But essentially, it's supposed to be a little spot that provides some cover and moisture for toads. I have had, excuse me, I have lots of toads in my yard, yay. And I have had a terracotta pot that's kind of buried down in the soil and it's got some leaf litter in it. And that was my makeshift toad abode. I've never had one use a toad abode, but it's still there. So, I know some people who've had some success with toad abodes. So I don't see any reason why not to try them. So yeah. Okay. And I see another question from Eddie about favorite spots for salamander migration. So this is a tough one, and I suggest hooking up with some of our local herp societies and nature groups. Like the Natural History Society in Baltimore is leading some different vernal pool hikes. And I'm trying to think of who else might be leading some. I know over in Northern Virginia, they've led some recent salamander hikes. So I highly suggest going and finding an organization who's doing one of these guided hikes because you have to make sure you've got permission to be out on the property after hours. And then you want to think about things like not accidentally stepping on some of them and some of that ethical, like herp etiquette and all of that. So that's why I always suggest trying to find a local group. But you might have some local salamander migration spots that you might not realize as you're driving around and you see a bunch of frogs on the road or some big chunky salamanders on the road. That's usually an indication that some good habitat is nearby. So that might be a good spot to go check out if you have permission to go there. So good questions. All right, any other questions? And you should be able to unmute yourself or raise your hand if you want to ask a physical question instead of typing it in the chat. So,
Well, this has been really interesting, Carrie. I appreciate you taking the time and sharing some wildly interesting information. And your enthusiasm is so catchy for everybody. It's and then somebody made a mention of your toad shirt.
yeah, I'm wearing my frog shirt, so you gotta represent, right?
Okay, did anybody else have any last questions before I stop the recording? Parting comments? Thank you, Carrie.
All right, thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and hope you all are excited to go out and listen for some of our local frogs and toads, and make note of the timings as well. When you hear your first peepers and you hear your first American toads and all of that. So good stuff to keep track of. So thank you.